You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, as we all know, Donald Trump suffered a major defeat at the hands of a federal trial court when they pushed back on Trump's ability to be able to fire probationary employees. That was a big win in pushing back against this administration. Trump obviously appealed that issue up to the appeals court. We now have an update on that. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, we do, Brian. It looks like the probationary employees were on the losing end of today's development because what happened was a lower court decided that these were unlawful terminations by the Trump administration and issued a preliminary injunction saying the federal government must rehire, must restore these wrongfully terminated employees to their previous jobs. Well, Brian, today, by a 2-1 split, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decided to just throw out that preliminary injunction directing that these terminated federal government employees be restated to their old jobs. Here is what they said. They said, listen, we're not ruling on whether the Trump administration lawfully or unlawfully terminated these employees. And I'll tell you, Brian, by all accounts and in courts across the land, it sure seems like, even if only based on preliminary rulings, that these were unlawful terminations. But that wasn't the basis of today's ruling by the Fourth Circuit. They said, look, 19 states in the District of Columbia brought this suit, and we don't think the courts have jurisdiction because we don't think the states have standing to bring these challenges against the terminations. So it really is a technical ruling. It is a win of sorts for the Trump administration and a loss, at least at the moment, for the wrongfully terminated employees. But, you know, there's some good news out there, even though this is a disheartening opinion, a dispiriting opinion, because those employees were in the process of being rehired. I'll tell you, Brian, these federal government employees are on one hell of a roller coaster ride. Their salaries hang in the balance. The health care for themselves and their families hang in the balance. But there is good news, because there are other cases in the system that continue to move forward. Yes, this one looks like there may be a jurisdictional issue because the states might not have been entitled to bring this suit. However, the appeals court said, even though we are throwing out the lower court preliminary injunction, the order to rehire these employees, the case will still continue and we will still fully litigate whether the states have standing. But Brian, there's a case right now out in the Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals in California, which has moved along a little bit farther in the process. And right now, there is still an order in place that the probationary employees must be rehired, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals refused to throw that one out. So that's being litigated through the system as well. So all hope is not lost, but today represents something of a setback for these temporary government employees who it still looks like were wrongfully terminated.
Glenn, you had mentioned that the plaintiffs in this case lost in a 2-1 decision, so it doesn't sound like they had the full court hearing this case. Is there any way for them to go back and request en banc review, meaning the entire court?
Yeah, Brian, absolutely. So remember, the plaintiffs, the parties that brought this suit, 19 states in the District of Columbia, will now have a decision to make. Do they want to ask the entire Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, what's called en banc review, to reconsider the 2-1 split decision by the 3-judge panel? Or do they perhaps want to take a step back and say, you know what, we will just completely litigate this issue to its fruition because, like I said, this is kind of a temporary ruling that was handed down today. But Brian, here's the other thing. They may take a look at this opinion and say, you know, if there really is an issue with respect to whether we, the states, have standing to continue litigating in this suit, it may very well be that they decide to give up the ghost because there are other cases, as we discussed a few minutes ago, that are working their way through the system where it is the temporary employees who maintain they were wrongfully terminated. So there is no standing issue. There is no jurisdictional issue, and hopefully their rights will ultimately be vindicated. So, you know, this is a challenging decision for the plaintiffs to make in this case. Do we keep fighting even though it seems like we are perhaps losing on a technicality, standing jurisdiction, or do we kind of give up knowing that the rights of these victims, these temporary employees, will still be vindicated, albeit in other courts and other forums.
Glenn, regardless of which case we're talking about here, whether it's the case that's in question right here or in the Fourth Circuit, or if it's the other case that's working its way through the court system, isn't this all a little bit moot anyway? Because really, the final arbiter of this stuff is going to be the Supreme Court at the end of the day. So we're going to go back and forth, and whichever side loses is ultimately going to appeal, but doesn't this kind of not matter until really just one court in this country has its say?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to look at it. I wouldn't say it doesn't matter, because the more federal circuit courts of appeal around the country hear cases, decide difficult or challenging or novel issues, and publish opinions, there is a body of law, appellate case law, that is being developed, and all of that will hopefully, if the Supreme Court justices are honest brokers of the law, it will inform where a whole host of federal judges come out on this precise issue. I have to believe, even though it seems like there is a block of judges who kind of have their mind made up anytime Donald Trump wants something, he's going to get it, regardless of the language of the Constitution. I would still like to think they take seriously the opinions that are issued by the lower federal circuit courts of appeal, and it has to have an impact on them, even if it doesn't win the day. So yes, you're right that the ultimate decider will always be the Supreme Court, and sometimes, they've done what we consider to be the right thing, remaining loyal to the express language of the Constitution, but often they have shown a willingness to do the wrong thing and do a favor, though, for Donald Trump in their rulings.
Look, I know that this case might seem a little narrow in the sense that, okay, these are just talking about some, a few probationary federal employees, and so why does it matter? But can you talk about why this does matter, especially in the context of what Trump wants to do, what he's laid out with Project 2025, and what it would mean if the federal government suddenly is purged of people like these very probationary employees who are loyal not to Donald Trump, but loyal rather to the Constitution?
Brian, it matters in both the micro sense and in the macro sense. In the micro sense, and there's nothing micro about tens of thousands of public servants who were hired for a reason. Why were they hired by the federal government, even if they were still in a probationary status, which for some of them means they could have been with the federal government up to almost 2 years?
Well, and I would add, probationary in their current role. So they might have been promoted because they were especially qualified, but then in their new role they become a probationary employee, but that just means that they're even more adept at what they're doing, more qualified for that role.
Exactly, and every employee was hired for a reason, because they had the right background, education, training, experience, expertise to serve the American people in a particular capacity.
Oftentimes, by the way, for less money than they would be able to command in the private sector.
Take it from a career federal prosecutor. I was a government lawyer for 30 years, Brian. I didn't get rich, but I wasn't in it for the money. I was in it to serve the people because I loved the work that I got to do. It was a privilege and an honor to do it. Just like when I was in the military, you don't join the military to get rich. You do it because you want to serve a cause bigger than yourself. And that is what these probationary employees were doing. There's no doubt about that. So in the micro sense, he is hurting a lot of people. And he is hurting the American people because they're being served by those probationary employees. Now, in the macro sense, this is yet another attempt at Donald Trump to grab as much dictatorial power as he can, run roughshod over the law and the Constitution, and continue to become the dictator he aspires to be, the one he told us he would be on day one. And boy, that is one promise Donald Trump has certainly kept, his efforts to become a dictator on day one.
Well, I think it's important too, because even if the fight doesn't impact you, eventually it will. And that's what we're seeing right now, that when Donald Trump feels emboldened because he was given an inch and he took a mile. So let's say, for example, that nobody feels like it's worth it to intervene in this case regarding probationary employees because there's only, a relatively small amount of probationary employees. Eventually, we will get to the point where Donald Trump will continue widening his net more and more and more, and it will have a major impact on his ability to touch a broad swath of people, but he will already have been so emboldened by virtue of the fact that folks didn't think it was necessary to intervene point at the beginning when we could have had a big impact. So I think that that's why it's so important that even in these relatively small battles, it's worth it to fight. And by the way, we've seen that already with these law firms. You have one law firm who decides to capitulate. What does that tell Donald Trump? Well, it tells him that he should become emboldened, that he's got a permission structure now to continue leaning on, seeking to extort even more law firms. But that wouldn't have happened if he didn't have one law firm show some weakness. And so if there's any blood in the water anywhere, if Donald Trump feels like he's getting his way anywhere, suddenly he feels and becomes emboldened to cast his net even wider. And so that's why it's especially important right now when we have the ability to fight, when it's just the probationary employees that are being targeted, knowing full well that his plan is to ultimately target all federal employees who are loyal to the Constitution and not completely servile, completely obsequious, completely sycophantic to Donald Trump himself. This is when we have to fight back, because we don't want to give him this idea that he's got carte blanche, a completely clear runway to run roughshod over our democracy and do whatever he wants.
Yeah, Brian, we have to fight on all fronts, large and small. If Donald Trump is involved in violations of the law, even relatively minor ones, we need to fight. Donald Trump is clearly violating the Constitution left, right, and center. The First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment's due process guarantees, the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel with the law firm extortion executive orders that you just mentioned. I mean, imagine he directed that lawyers from disfavored law firms, ones he didn't like, were not permitted to enter federal government buildings, including courthouses. Boy, if that's not a violation of the Sixth Amendment right to counsel somewhere along the way, I don't know what is. So we have to fight on all fronts because, you know, like you say, give him an inch, he's going to take a mile. And unless we stand up, unless we speak out, and unless we go into court early and often, and let's face it, of the hundreds of suits that have been brought, Donald Trump has won relatively few. And the people who he has victimized have been winning almost across the board from coast to coast. And we need to keep that up. We need to keep the pressure on because pressure bursts pipes.
Well, perfectly put. And for those who are watching right now, keep in mind that Glenn and I will continue to bring you every update, every legal update as it continues to come in. So if you'd like to support our work, stay on top of the news, and support independent media more broadly at a time when I think it's especially needed, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.